Welcome you to the third session of our lecture series on the European Union and the fight against global climate change. As you are probably aware, today, 15th of October, the European Council started in town. It's, among other things, discussing this very subject. So we are timely in our discussions here, I guess. Before we really start this session, perhaps one announcement. There have been a number of emails to us how you can actually access the slides that have been presented at the previous lectures. If you go to the lecture series website, www.ies.be/climate lectures, and you click on the names of the lecturers, you'll find these slides. You can download then the slides, those slides that we have and can make available at this point in time. It's obviously continuously updated. Apologies, I guess, on behalf of Marc and myself as the co-organizers. We weren't here last week for other climate policy and law duties. But we are back, as you can see, for tonight on the EU climate policy, state and perspectives. And it's my pleasure to introduce the two speakers, although you only see one at the moment. So the first one is Marc Pallemaerts, who is Senior Fellow and Head of the Environmental Governance Research Team at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and obviously co-organizer of this lecture series. And the second one is Stephan Singer, and he's a climate and energy expert for the WWF, and he heads the European Climate and Energy Policy team there at the moment. He has given us a call that he will be a little bit late, so we expect him any minute. And as you can imagine, that's busy times for those people working on these matters and trying to influence policy making. So while we expect Stephan to arrive during the next 15 minutes or so, I suggest that we already start. Was anyway planned that Marc would start the lecture series today. So please, Marc, the floor is yours on EU climate policies, state and perspectives.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. And thank you all for being here tonight. The official title of tonight's session says something neutral like the EU climate change policy, state and perspectives, but that is the collective title for the two presentations that you will hear, mine and Stephan Singer's. And so I took the freedom to add a subtitle of my own, looking at the development of EU climate change policy over the years, that is in fact over almost the last 20 years now, and I have characterized this development as a movement from hot air to hard law. Now, of course, the term hot air is probably already familiar to you. I remember Sebastian mentioned it during his introductory lecture. It has a particular technical meaning in climate change policy because it refers to the excess emission allowances that some former communist countries have secured during the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. Of course, I'm not using it in that particular meaning. I'm not suggesting that the EU's policy is based on the use of hot air. In the technical sense, I'm probably using the term more in its common sense. A lot of talk, but very little action until quite recently, and that is in fact what we will see. All right. So it's very important to stress that climate change policy in the EU, the internal development of that policy has always been very closely linked to the negotiations at the international level on the global climate change regime. As Sebastian already explained during his introductory lecture, the two processes, the multilateral process at the global level and the internal decision-making process within the EU have been very intricately linked from the very beginning. And so, in fact, it is possible to analyze EU climate change policy by cutting it into successive stages that are linked with particularly significant steps, milestones in the international process. Indeed, slowly this policy has evolved from what were essentially declarations of intent, political statements, political commitments, but with no binding force, to only more recently legislative measures that actually impose obligations on the member states, hard obligations, and that is what I meant when I spoke of hard law. And of course, this is rather remarkable if one thinks that, as those of you who are familiar with the debate on European integration and the role of the European Union, what distinguishes the EU from other international organizations is precisely that it has the power to take legally binding decisions, even without the consent of all its member states, that it has supranational legislative power, and in fact it has only started truly exercising this power rather late during the process of its climate policy. All right, so what are the successive stages? The very early stage coincides with essentially the process of putting climate change on the international policy agenda, and I will not dwell too long on that process itself, because you have already had an overview of it. But broadly, one can say the first period runs from 1989, and I will refer to one particular event in that year, to the year of the Rio Summit, or as it was officially called, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted and signed by the vast majority of states making up the international community, as well as the European community as a party in its own right. So the second stage in the development of EU policy coincides with the period between the signing of the UN Convention to the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. So essentially from mid-92 to the end of 97, December 97, when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted as the result of the second stage in the international negotiation process. First stage leading to the Framework Convention, second stage leading to the protocol, as you have seen. The next stage then in the international process, and again also a significant period in the development of EU policy, runs from the signing of the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, the protocol was adopted in December 97, but it was open for signature only a few months later, so early 1998, to the culmination of the third stage in the international negotiations, namely the Bonn Conference in July 2001, leading to agreement on the implementation rules for the Kyoto Protocol. And as we will see during that period, the EU was almost entirely focused on the international negotiations. And then, after Bonn, a few months later, we had the formalization the details of what was agreed in Bonn at the Conference of the Parties in Marrakesh in November 2001. And then we had this long period of uncertainty and political struggle about the ratification and entry into force of the protocol, during which, as Sebastian explained, the EU was extremely active on the international stage. Now, what is quite interesting is that this really marks also a significant turning point in internal policy, because actually it is between Bonn and Marrakesh, between these two international events, that the European Commission actually proposes, puts forward and submits to the other institutions its first major Kyoto package of measures, including the now famous emissions trading scheme. And then this brings us to the final period after the entry into force of the protocol and the first meeting of the parties to the protocol in Montreal in late 2005. The whole process of implementation, of course, is going into, is becoming ever more urgent for the EU, as the first deadline under the Kyoto Protocol, the end of the first commitment period, is coming closer, and in fact, 2000 and the first commitment period, as you know, started in 2008, but the operation of the EU emissions trading system internally already in 2005. So, well, this is a period which we are still in today, and in which there is actually quite balanced attention to both aspects of the policy, namely the internal as well as the external, as the EU is debating a new package of climate measures since January of this year, and this debate is in internal negotiation is in full swing, but at the same time the EU has been working hard externally to launch the next stage of the global negotiation process, with a major breakthrough achieved in Bali in December of last year, and now actually the formal start of negotiations on an agreement for the post-2012 period. All right, so these are the 5 periods that I will analyze, but again, my job tonight is not to dwell on the international scene, but to see how the internal policy development fits into this schedule. All right, so the first period, the first few years, the early years of climate change policy really are a period in which the Union, in fact at the time it was still officially called the Community, and it only had 12 member states in the beginning of this period, in fact for the whole of this period, developed a common position on climate change, a common position towards the external world. So the focus of EU policy was on how to participate in the multilateral negotiations that were officially launched in 1989, and how to position itself as a strong and unified actor in those negotiations. So the year 1989 can be chosen as the starting point, first of all because of what happened globally. Of course, the activities of international organizations already started before 1989, but 1989 marks the real start of the political process of negotiating an international climate regime. And I would just want to mention 2 important events, because EU member states played an important role in putting climate change on the global agenda. In March 1989, President Mitterrand of France, together with the Dutch Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers, and also with the Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, took the initiative of organizing the first ever summit of heads of state and government on entirely focusing on environmental issues. And that was held on the 11th of March 1989 at the Peace Palace in The Hague. And there were about 25 political leaders from, not just from Europe, and in fact not all member states of the EU were even invited, but a group of member states that had been invited, selected, handpicked, one would say, by the European organizers because of their perceived rather progressive policy on international environmental issues. And the focus of the Hague Summit was on the protection of the global atmosphere, and with two subjects, the protection of the ozone layer, because negotiations on that particular issue were also in full swing at the time, but also climate change as the two most burning global environmental issues facing the planet in the run-up to the 1992 Rio Summit. And then at the end of that year, the Dutch government, again, took the initiative of hosting the first ministerial conference on climate change, which was held near The Hague in Noordwijk in November of the same year, and which, well, it was not a formal negotiating meeting for the convention, for the climate convention, but effectively it played quite an important role in defining the terms of the debate. So, in this international context, the EU had to position itself, and it is actually in June of that year that the Council of Ministers, the Council of the European Communities, adopted the first ever resolution on climate change. So a resolution, not simply a political act, in which essentially it put this issue on the agenda of the EU, and specifically invited the Commission to formulate proposals. But what is particularly significant is that the resolution doesn't really say much about what those proposals should entail, about what would be the respective role of the community in the member states. It refers to those proposals, Commission proposals, as a contribution to the international debate. So first and foremost, the EU should be in a position to contribute to the international debate. And, well, as for what we will do internally and how we will do it, that would come later. So, then about a year later, after the Commission had started producing its first assessments and proposals, its first communication, climate change for the first time appeared on the agenda of EU heads of state and government. For the first time it was addressed at a meeting of the European Council during the Irish presidency. The Dublin European Council actually had a rather important environmental agenda, because the Dublin European Council adopted a declaration on the environmental imperative, as it was called, with a lot of green rhetoric, both for internal and external consumption. But one of the specific calls of the EU leaders was to urge member states and the community to develop targets and strategies for limiting emissions of greenhouse gases. Then in 1990, of course, we have the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an important contribution to the international debate. And again, a few months later, there is an EU political response at a joint meeting of energy and environment ministers. So that was, of course, particularly appropriate for the subject. In October 1990, energy and environment ministers of the member states met together, and they adopted council conclusions in which they first defined a political objective for the community as a whole, and I'll return to that in a minute. And why on the 29th of October 1990? Well, very clearly because the very same day started the second World Conference on Climate Change, organized by the World Meteorological Organization, together with the United Nations Environment Programme and a host of other international bodies, where obviously the first assessment report of the IPCC was going to be debated, and what further steps would have to be taken by the international community. And this was a very major political event, and actually, as the World Conference met in Geneva, the formal negotiating process actually started in the United Nations General Assembly, because it is during its session that in the autumn of 1990 that the General Assembly adopted a resolution whereby it formally launched the negotiations leading to event that would eventually lead to the adoption of the UN Convention, the Framework Convention, and very importantly, the General Assembly also set a deadline, because it said that the convention, it established an intergovernmental negotiating group, and it said the convention should be ready for signature by the time of the Rio summit. Well, if one takes a closer look at what the energy and environment ministers of the then 12 member states actually agreed on in October 1990, we can characterize this as essentially a common external position which is based on internal ambiguity between rather conflicting positions. Well, the conclusions say that the community and its member states are willing to take actions. So actions refers both to action, one presumes, both to action by the community, but also to national action, and one doesn't say who is going to do what, aimed at reaching, and this is where the political objective of the EU for the first stage of the global negotiations comes from, reaching stabilization of the EU's total CO2 emissions by the year 2000 at 1990 levels. But very importantly, of course, the language in the community as a whole. This statement said nothing at all about what every individual member state would commit to. And it was subject, this political commitment was subject to two conditions. One, reciprocity from other leading countries, meaning essentially the United States and other major OECD countries, assuming that they undertake similar commitments. And at the same time, acknowledging that a number of member states, but a number of EU member states individually, nationally, before October 1990 had already defined national targets, and in fact different ones. Some targets stabilization targets, some actually reduction targets, but by different dates. So the EU common position is actually a nice sort of cover for a range of different positions, situations of the member states, but of course a way also of presenting a united front towards the outside. But most importantly, there was also an important aspect of internal compromise in reaching those conclusions, and that is the second part of the 1990 conclusions, which is not very often remembered, but in fact this second part of the conclusions shows that a number of member states of the community were not at all intending to stabilize or even cut their emissions, because they were arguing within the Union, much like developing countries were arguing internationally, that well, they had relatively low levels of energy consumption, relatively low levels of economic development, of course, compared to the other member states, and therefore were entitled to have CO2 targets and/or strategies corresponding to their economic and social development, which is, of course, a euphemism to being allowed to increase their total national emissions, even their total per capita emissions or emissions based on GDP, while improving. They did recognize that in the process of their growth, they would aim to improve energy efficiency. So it was quite clear for a number of member states, of course starting with the cohesion countries, that this would, that there would have to be differentiation of targets, and very significant differentiation of targets within the EU, and that individual member states, not all individual member states, were prepared to subscribe even to this stabilization target. All right, then we move to the second stage, June 1992. We have the Rio conference. The framework convention is signed. That is the international event. But what happens 2 days, I believe, before the official opening of the UN conference, the Commission barely manages to agree on its first proposal for an actual community measure that would be aimed at achieving this stabilization target. And this is the famous Commission proposal for introducing a tax on CO2 emissions and energy that was agreed within the College of Commissioners only on the eve of the Rio conference. So because the EU had to go there with something that looked like a credible position, with at least a proposal to show that it was working towards achieving its political objective. But this proposal, as you probably know, was never adopted, and it remained on the table for a very long time. But in fact, in actual practice, it's essentially an external purpose, namely of making the EU position somewhat more credible internationally. When the community, together with its member states, signed the UN Framework Convention in Rio, a formal declaration was made upon signature. It is, of course, in legal language, but this declaration shows that there was a very strong debate behind the scenes within the EU as to the exact division of competence between the community and the member states. Who would be responsible for implementing the Framework Convention? Who would take measures? Some member states felt that it would indeed be more appropriate to take common measures, such as the proposed tax that the Commission had just put on the table. Others were strongly opposed to common measures, and considered that in fact the most measures would have to be taken at the national level. And because, as the lawyers among you know, signing, for the community to become a party to an international treaty has implications with respect to competence and the division of competences. It was felt necessary upon signing the convention to make a statement that this would be without prejudice to the division of competence and responsibilities, basically leaving this to be further argued and resolved internally. And so, given this particular context, it isn't surprising that internally not very much happened after the community signed the Framework Convention, except its ratification, and that was decided formally by the Council in December '93. And at the same time, the political agreement was reached on a very minimal package of internal measures. I haven't detailed them because essentially they are only of, say, historical significance. What those measures included, not the tax proposal, but the first so-called monitoring decision, basically a council decision requiring member states to provide certain information on their emissions, on their national climate policies and measures, etc., to the Commission, just an obligation to supply information. A directive on energy efficiency, but with very vague and general provisions, leaving member states a very wide measure of discretion as to what action to take specifically, the so-called SAFE directive, as well as a funding scheme to assist the development of renewable energies, the Alternaire directive. Well, these are, but nothing that went beyond essentially soft instruments such as community financial support for certain research and development projects, information exchange, and some weak coordination of national policies. Again, when the community ratified the Framework Convention, it made another declaration which again left the issue of who would do what nicely ambiguous. This declaration simply said that the commitment will be fulfilled in the community as a whole through action by the community and its member states within the respective competence of each. Well, there is perhaps one little step forward in that it is already clear here that at least member states have accepted that there might be some community measures, some common measures, but they are unable to go beyond reaffirming the Council conclusions, the stabilization target of October 1990, and then just to say, well, the community and its member states are elaborating a coherent strategy in order to attain this objective. So more than 3 years after the objective was first announced, the Council was only able to say, we are still working on it. We are elaborating our strategy as to how to attain this objective. Basically because there was no agreement on anything beyond the most basic measures. In fact, during this period there was an endless political debate within the Council and between and also with involvement of the Parliament, obviously of the Commission, and all stakeholders on what became known in the jargon as CCPMs, or Common and Coordinated Policies and Measures, where you have one group of member states favouring common measures, i.e. measures adopted by the community, using the community method, the community legislative powers, and others who were saying actually most of what we have to do to implement the Framework Convention we will do through coordinated measures. That is, each member state will have its own measures, its own policies, but we will coordinate essentially within the Union through what is essentially a form of what today one would call the open method of coordination, loose form of intergovernmental cooperation and coordination based on unanimous agreement. But this was, of course, a fig leaf to mask the lack of agreement on the main measure proposed by the Commission in 1992, which was completely blocked in the ECOFIN Council, because being a tax measure, this was, of course, being considered not by the environment ministers, but by the finance ministers, and essentially no agreement on any other binding internal measure of any significance during this entire period. And it is only, again, under pressure of the international agenda, a few months before the conference in Kyoto that the community had to make its position credible towards the outside world, and in order to do that, it adopted the very first burden-sharing agreement, but I put agreement between quotation marks here because it wasn't really an agreement, it was essentially a negotiating position. This was, the community was proposing in the negotiations on the Kyoto Protocol that all industrialized countries should subscribe to a 15% reduction objective. And in order to make this proposal somewhat credible, it barely managed to agree on how the 12 member states, by then they had become 15, how the 15 would share out a 10% reduction. Not a 15% reduction they were proposing, but only a 10%. If you added up the figures, you came to a 10% reduction for the EU 15. And then they said, well, and should the Kyoto Protocol agree on 15%, we'll figure out how to do the rest afterwards. Okay, as you know, the Kyoto Protocol eventually did not include even a 10% reduction for the EU. The finally agreed target was 8%. If the rest of the world had turned around and said, okay, you have a deal, 15%, or even 10%, the community would have been in serious difficulties. But it did not have to face that embarrassing situation. Yet after the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, the internal policy-making process didn't really go into further, it didn't really significantly accelerate, because there was still this argument between proponents of common measures and proponents of coordinated measures. The only significant decision that was taken was in June 1998, was again through purely a political decision, a political instrument, agreement on the burden sharing for the 8% Kyoto target. So, and this agreement, which was laid down in the form of Council conclusions, was only formalized, was only made legally binding 4 years later, when the community ratified the protocol. Again, those conclusions of June 1998 were very difficult to negotiate, and apart from the figures on who would do what, who would cut, which member state would cut emissions, which member state would increase emissions, etc., there was again a list of common and coordinated policies and measures to be further considered, elaborated by the Commission or considered by member states in the form of coordinated measures. But nothing much materialized, except one thing. In October 1998, the Commission, with the support of the Council, of the Environment Ministers, reached a voluntary agreement with the automobile manufacturers, by which the car manufacturers, through their three associations, the Association of European Car Manufacturers and the Japanese and Korean counterpart, agreed on a voluntary target for achieving average CO2 emissions of 140 grams of CO2 per kilometer as an average for new cars put on the market by I forget what the target date was, but anyway, 2008, exactly. Well, this agreement, as we now know, and I'm sure Stephan will remind you, and actually we will have also one of my colleagues will come and speak on the latest developments in this area. This agreement essentially was a substitute for legislative action, but it didn't deliver. It did not achieve its objectives, And 10 years later, the Commission finally had to recognize that the agreement would not achieve the target and had to come up with a legislative proposal. It is only towards the end of this period, as the international negotiations were again moving towards a climax, that the Commission launched a process to develop additional EU measures, which became known as the European Climate Change Programme, a rather peculiar way of developing and examining all possibilities for emission reductions through a multi-stakeholder process involving not only the different directorates general within the Commission, but also the various stakeholders and members. And this process was launched in June 2000. A first report, not proposals, not actual Commission proposals, but only a report of this process came a year later, just before the Bonn Climate Conference. All right, and then suddenly in 2001, as international agreement is reached on the implementing rules for the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol suddenly becomes ratifiable, as the saying went. Well, it wasn't possible anymore, of course, to hide behind the international negotiation process. Again, the EU had to move forward and become more serious about its commitments. So, once the Marrakesh Accords had been adopted at the end of 2001, then suddenly ratification and implementation of the protocol became serious business and was treated as a priority. As I mentioned, the Commission, in fact, submitted its first Kyoto package of measures just before the Marrakesh meeting, so the timing again was not coincidental. It was part of keeping up the momentum between the Bonn meeting and the Marrakesh meeting of the United Nations Convention. This first Kyoto package included essentially two major measures. A proposal for ratification, formal ratification of the protocol, including making the 1998 political burden sharing agreement legally binding, and at the same time also the Commission's proposal for the internal emission trading system, which was adopted in 2003. But the real breakthrough, if you like, came with the decision to proceed with ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, which was formally adopted on the 25th of April 2002, and the instrument of ratification deposited the 30th of May of the same year. Actually, the whole political event was organized by the EU presidency together with the United Nations, as all member states deposited their instruments of ratification simultaneously, which they rarely do in an international negotiation. Now, when this decision was adopted, there was some political debate about that showed that Kyoto implementation and the further process thereof would not be an easy matter, because it would have far-reaching consequences, and there was some debate as to what would be the proper legal basis for this decision of April 2002. Should it be based on the general provisions on environmental policy, Article 175.1 of the treaty, which implied decision-making by qualified majority within the Council, or should it be based on Article 175.2 of the treaty, which would have implied unanimous decision-making within the Council? Those of you who are familiar with the environmental provisions of the treaty will know that Article 175.2 lists a number of aspects of environmental policy for which qualified majority decision-making within the Council and the co-decision procedure don't apply. Very sensitive matters for which unanimous decision-making within the Council is still required. And one of those is any measures that would significantly affect the national energy policies of the Member States. And some Member States were saying, well, in fact, implementing the Kyoto Protocol is going to significantly affect our national energy policies. They probably were right. Nevertheless, this was eventually papered over. The compromise was that formally the decision was based on Article 175.1 in conjunction with Article 300, which is the treaty-making article, but it was nevertheless adopted unanimously. So the legal basis used was one which would have allowed qualified majority decision-making, but the decision was considered politically so important that it could only be taken unanimously. And then, and only then, around that time, the internal legislative process started accelerating. There had been a proposal on the table already since 2000 for a measure to promote renewable energy for electricity production. This was formally adopted in September 2001. So this is the first measure, legislative measure of any significance, but still it should be stressed that this directive only laid down indicative targets, legally non-binding targets for renewable energy for each member state. But nevertheless, it did play an important role in promoting the development of renewables throughout the EU. And then the following year, a measure was taken on energy performance of buildings, and gradually the process started accelerating. And I'm not going to dwell on every individual measure. In fact, you can find them here. The most important one, adopted in October 2003, of course, was the directive instituting the emissions trading system, which I won't dwell upon because, again, you will have a special session in this lecture series entirely devoted to the ETS, but that was, of course, a very major step. And after that, further measures followed. For instance, in October 2003, there was agreement on a very watered-down form of energy taxation, which did not have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but nevertheless provides a basis for harmonization of energy taxation. The existing monitoring mechanism was upgraded. Measures were taken to promote combined heat and power, as well as a directive that provides a legal basis for adopting energy efficiency standards for so-called energy-using products. And so this is how we come to the final stage, starting after the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol and the first meeting of the parties in Montreal. Additional internal measures resulting from the work undertaken under the European Climate Change Programme continue to be adopted. For instance, this directive that sets, again, non-binding energy efficiency targets, as well as a number of measures addressing not carbon dioxide, but the so-called F-gases, fluorinated greenhouse gases, included in the Kyoto Protocol, two measures adopted in May 2006. And this is how, finally, we reach the stage of preparation of EU policy beyond 2012. And this was started with, as usual, with a Commission communication. And the debate immediately went to the highest level with the European Council in March 2005, giving its support to the EU's ambition to reinvigorate the international negotiations with support for the 2 degrees objective, and for the first time a figure for emission reduction efforts beyond 2012. This was not yet a unilateral commitment, but it gave a range of what would have to be aimed at by all economically more advanced countries. And this enabled the Commission to be bolder in its proposals. Another development which played a role, and this is where, for the first time, internal policy drivers become important. And here, I think, the key events were the rejection of the Constitutional Treaty in 2005 in the referenda in France and the Netherlands, with a debate on the legitimacy of European integration, and this actually was seized upon by the Commission as an opportunity to use the communities or unions' role in the struggle against climate change as a way to legitimize the European project with the European citizens, because it was quite obvious that this is an issue that citizens in the EU cared about. But at the same time, there was the cutting off of gas supplies to Ukraine by Russia in, I think that was January 2006, around that time, which suddenly gave a boost to EU energy policy, to the Commission's long-standing ambitions of having a stronger role in energy policy. And so in March 2006, the European Council agreed on an energy policy, well, at least on the basic principles of an energy policy for Europe, with 3 objectives. As you can see, the third one being an environmental objective. And this then, 1 year later, led to further steps by the European Council, the famous March 2007 European Council conclusions, with the EU's unilateral commitment to a 20% reduction by 2020, and call on the Commission to propose an additional package of measures. And this is where I will conclude, and where the next speaker will take over, namely the proposal by the Commission in January of this year of the famous climate energy package, which is a package of legislative and other measures designed to enable the community to achieve this 20% unilateral commitment. And these are the most important measures included in this package, but I will not dwell on them anymore, since Stephan will focus on the latest developments. Thank you very much.
And even the Clinton administration was not an easy to negotiate with partner. People tend to forget that one. So if we get Obama in place, please, let's still remain sober. The Americans are a tough nut to crack in any case. And it was always easy for the rest of the world to agree on something against the Bush administration, because they are the evil, they are the forces of darkness. It was easy. And if things didn't go through, we could say always, well, the Americans blocked things. This is over very likely, even with McCain, because both candidates will bring the US back in one way or the other to international negotiation. Differentiation will have it really much more difficult for the EU to maintain its self-proclaimed leadership, whether it's true or not. Anyway, what happened then, there was the rescue operation of the so-called Top Bis in Bonn in June 2001. Was installed under the leadership of the then Swedish presidency. And the interesting thing was, and I think history was on our side, that in the first half of 2001, Sweden was in the presidency, and the second half of 2001 it was Belgium. And history tells us that small countries, in the EU always are very good presidencies to the EU, because they have no bloody egos. They're not big and fat and rich and want to determine the agenda, like Germany, France, UK, or other countries. They work with others together. And I must say, I had and still a very high esteem for both presidencies, for Sweden and for Belgium, which basically managed to create an alliance, not against the US, because the US was out, because Bush defected Kyoto and said it's all rubbish, I'm not doing that one. But then the art of squaring the circle was to get the remaining countries together to create a critical mass. With Japan, with Canada, Australia, and Russia, as difficult as it is. And with the G77 and China, which were chaired by Iran at this point in time. You can imagine another not very easy country, for a variety of reasons. But those guys managed, Sweden and Belgium managed to create a kind of alliance of the EU with the G77 and China to hammer through an agreement in Bonn in June 2001 to agree on a follow-up conference to finalize the Marrakesh Accord. There's very technical, detailed rules which define all the details on monitoring, verification, implementation. Don't ask me what all is in there. I don't know it all, to be honest. I'm not a lawyer. But it's a very important groundwork for the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed, I think, under the wise leadership of the Belgian presidency, and Marc was chief negotiator for the Belgians, for the EU, for the Belgians. I think he didn't talk about them, but I think we should remember that one. That if you want to have inside information, I don't know whether he tells you that one, but he's a person to bore, you know, to ask him. He knows all these people inside, outside, internally, very, very well. So this is just to tell you that, at least from my side of view, I have high esteem for his work and also for the Swedish at this point in time, because without this work, Kyoto would not have been rescued, and we would not be where we are now. We would not now talk about a post-2012 regime, which is based on the achievements, shortcomings of Kyoto. If Kyoto would have collapsed, and the Russians would not have ratified finally, which is another story how that one happened, then I think we wouldn't be where we are now. And I think the EU wouldn't have had the understanding that they can work with partners, in particular developing countries, to create a critical mass against other countries and then bring them on board, even against the bully from North America. The second thing is, what for the EU was new, and I come back to that one because it is very important for today's understanding of this energy package. The debate on climate change is not a debate about mitigation and actions in the EU alone. That's a debate in the meantime of equity, fairness, burden sharing, historic responsibility, adaptation to climate change, financial and resource transfer. So the agenda has broadened over time. And one of the key reasons, I think, what was an eye-opener for the European Union was, and it was my first conference of the parties, you know, I'm a fossil to this entire thing. In 1995, the conference of the party #1 in Berlin, Germany, when the European Union still at the position, all countries should do the same. The European Union said basically developing countries should do the same as developed countries. And it was luckily that in 1995, at this conference of the parties, the United States of America, under the Clinton administration, didn't want to agree on any policies and measures or targets or timetables which could put sort of necessary to strengthen the Rio Convention Marc talked about. Because people thought, many governments thought, the Rio Convention to stabilize emissions at the year 2000 and 1990 level is not adequate in order to comply with Article 4.2 of the Convention to prevent the climate change. And I said, there needs to be an amendment to the Convention or a protocol, whatever, but we need to get a mandate for that one. And the EU was not very interested in one that didn't know to look at to whom. US didn't want it, Canada didn't want it, but then it happened that within the EU there was a minority development with folks who detected within the G77 and China, particularly with India and the AUSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, which are one of the foremost vulnerable potential victims of climate change. They were very interested in having a legally binding agreement on cutting emissions, because the convention target was some kind of voluntary, and it was stabilization and not emissions reduction. And then there was the creation of a so-called Green Group. And the Green Group was the European Union plus G77 in China minus OPEC, minus the oil exporting countries. I think it was the first and so far the last time that G77 and China more or less openly went against a quite big cartel of their own membership. Don't forget there are about, how many are there? 22 developing countries which are members of OPEC. Venezuela, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and so on. They're quite important and quite powerful countries. So I think that was the first time when the EU tasted the idea to work with developing countries really makes sense to achieve something, and they understood developing countries have very, very different, different not only ideas but different tasks to look at. Addressing poverty, eradication, addressing sustainable development, and not necessarily climate change, which at this point in time was considered a kind of luxury issue, and still is to some extent if you observe debates in developing countries where the climate debate is mainly done by national elites, and not necessarily something that goes into the population, because they have daily needs which are very different. So I think that is a kind of, if you allow, introductory for me to look into the issue, how we see the EU today, how we can work with the EU, how can we help the EU, and how can we push the EU, last but not least, towards an equitable, fair, and ambitious agreement in Copenhagen, because that's what the world needs. And it is more than just emissions reductions, although those are a very important part of it. Okay, let me add, before I go on the EU package, how does this go down here? Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay. Marc has talked about the emergence of the 2 degrees threshold. Where does it come from? Why 2 degrees? Why does the EU embrace the target, or why does the EU propose that staying below 2 degree global warming compared to pre-industrial temperature is such an important threshold or yardstick for future climate negotiation? Why not 2.5 degrees? Why not 3? Why not 6? Why not 1? There are quite a couple of reasons for 2 degrees. One reason is depicted here in the graph. It comes from Martin Parry and his team from the Hadley Center, which is also in another form in the IPCC report, which was published last year. That if you surpass, or the world surpasses, the threshold of 2 degree global warming, then the risk, in particular of water shortages, freshwater shortages, seen as this blue wave, is exponentially increasing towards exposing almost half of the world population, showing on the right side of the graph up to 3.5 billion people. That's up to half the population of the world, exposing them to water shortage. And knowing that water already is a big strain, in particular to vulnerable communities in developing countries, that is a bummer. In comparison to that one, the risk of malaria, the risk of hunger, for instance, depicted here in the yellow and in the reddish, how do you say, graph, will only affect, or will be imposed on only maximum 100 to 300 million people. Now, that is harmless, but the issue of water stress, water shortage, which already is an issue for many developing countries, by surpassing 2 degrees, was one of the reasons why the EU embraced on that target. There are other reasons. I don't go into that one in detail. Well, that's what we're observing currently, the way of how climate policy is proceeding globally. That isn't good enough, I would say. One of the reasons why that is the case is that one. I don't know whether you can read that one. On the left side, great-granddad says, end child labor, it'll kill American industry. Granddad says, the 8-hour day, it'll kill American industry. And dad saying, environmental laws, it'll kill American industry. And now the industry bosses these days, quite simplified way, say, carbon caps, they will kill European industries. It's not that simple, it's more subtle, but one of the biggest obstacles we have seen in the energy, in the debate on the energy package, which we have been involved in, is the very, very strong involvement of energy-intensive industries, making this debate their debate. Dominating the debate about carbon leakage, being exposed to setting hundreds of thousands of people on the street, the energy package potentially destroying entire industrial bases in Europe, and talking about as if that would be the doomsday of the world. And they have managed to dominate the debate in the Parliament and in the Council, unfortunately. I'll go back to that one later. But this is still an ongoing battle we are fighting. We have, I wouldn't call them forces of darkness, but we have a major, I would say, group of certain industries in all countries, and in Belgium and Germany, and Poland and Italy, which fundamentally use their access to prime ministers, ministers of economy, to block things, to undermine things, to derail things. Because that issue of climate change has gone beyond environmental policy, which per se is a good thing. You know, ministers of finance get involved, trade ministers get involved, ministers of economy get involved, even heads of states get involved. But there's just a shortcoming because those guys are not by themselves, let me say, tree huggers. They're not the environmental ministers, the goodies, which usually are not the most powerful guys. So they listen to those people who are concerned. What are the trends we're observing these days? And this is very new work which came out of the Carbon Disclosure Project. I don't go much into detail. What we are seeing here, and depicted in the black dots is, and the curves you're seeing are the business as usual scenarios from the IPCC in terms of emissions trajectories between 1990 and 2010 that could go on until 2100, and they're all business as usual assumptions. Business as usual means what happens with emissions if nothing has happened, if there's no intervention by politics, legislation, or standards or technologies. Despite Kyoto, despite debates on energy security, despite high oil and gas prices, despite many other reasons to curb the use of fossil fuels and to stop deforestation, the actual global emissions are somewhat at the top of the worst business as usual projection by the IPCC. And that's worrying. What we're seeing globally, and that's a call for urgency, what we're seeing is that the real world is behaving in a way as if they are not at all interested in dealing with climate change. That's the globe as such. In that respect, if you look into the impact of emission to the atmosphere, the amount of, this is again very new science, came out a couple of days ago. The amount of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is increasing annually quite drastically with an almost exponential rate. Between, let's say, 1980 and 1989, per year, CO2 was increased by 1.6 ppm or milligram per year. That was growing between 2000 and 2007 to already 2 milligram per year, ppm per year. In 2007, record growth of 2.2 milligram per year. So the amount of CO2 enriched in the atmosphere is growing each year. And the stuff is staying in the atmosphere for at least 100, if not 1,000 years. The biological decay time of CO2 is comparably small. That's the reaction. Similar things we see, and that's the direct function of that one, the emissions to the atmosphere. Between 1990 and 1999, the fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions increased by almost 1% per year. Between 2000 and 2007, they increased by 3.5% per year, again globally. So much for the urgency. So where are we today? We're today at about 383 ppm CO2. Doesn't mean CO very much, but this is about almost 40% above anything mankind has ever experienced. That is about 435 CO2 equivalent. That includes the other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And that leads to an observed and measured temperature increase of almost 0.8 degree. It's not very much, but it's a huge implication. That is a global average temperature. 0.8 degree compared to pre-industrial temperature. The world is committed, even if we would stop emissions now, we would go to zero, the zero diet from now on. Still, because of the delay time of the ocean, because of nature takes time to react, we are still committed to another 0.3 to 0.6 warming at least, even if we stop globally by now. We are committed, and again, sea level rise even reacts still later. Sea level rise is a function of melting of terrestrial ice, Greenland, of glaciers, and of course of expansion of water, which becomes warmer. We are committed to about 0.6 to 1.2 meter sea level rise by 2100 in case we keep on doing what we are doing. We may be committed to a sea level rise of 2.5 to 5.1 meter sea level rise by 2300, even under a scenario which controls temperature to below 3 degree global warming. That's very new research coming out of the US. That is you may say this is in 300 years. Well, civilization in Europe is almost 2,000 years old. Worldwide civilization has a history of 4,000 years. I'm not saying this comes overnight, but 200 years is not too far. And you don't jump from 0.1 meter to 5.1 meter with an overnight. There's a time in there. I can predict to you there's not a single city, at least in Europe, and by no means in developing countries, which is adjusted for a sea level rise of 5.1 meter. They have to be evacuated, many of them. And most of the population in the world, and even more developing countries, are living close to the marine environment, close to deltas, for historic reason, because they're very fertile soil. That's where the agriculture is, also the freshwater is. This is a huge evacuation program, what we are currently inserting in the atmosphere. So climate change doesn't stop at the year 2100. Keep that in mind. Currently, Greenland loses ice per year, Greenland, equivalent 3 times the Arctic Glacier. You may not know what the Arctic Glacier is, or you may know it. The Arctic Glacier is the largest and biggest glacier we have in the Alps of Europe. And this is a really, really large glacier. Have a look at Google, look at this glacier. Each year, 3 times the amount of the Arctic Glacier. And this amount is increasing each year. If we lose the Arctic, if we lose the Greenland ice sheet, only the Greenland ice sheet, I'm not talking about losing the glaciers from the Himalaya, I'm not talking about the Western Arctic ice shield or the Arctic or the glaciers in the Alpine, just Greenland. If we lose Greenland ice, that alone triggers sea level rise of up to 7.5 meters. Not now, not in 2100, but by 2300. We're putting in a legacy in the system which is disastrous for many people. The Nicholas Stern, the guy who did this economics report 2 years ago and looked into the cost of climate change, economic cost, said with a sea level rise of just 1 meter globally, just 1 meter, we impose basically dynamics, and we impose threats to at least 200 million people globally. Just 1 meter. Imagine what 5 meters would mean. This is not just Calcutta, not just Kapstadt, not just Bombay or Mumbai. This is also New York. This is Florida, and this is many cities in developed countries as well. We have the lowest sea ice in Arctic in history. Much lower than predicted by the very recent IPCC models. Much lower than predicted by the most negative, most pessimistic IPCC models. Nature reacts faster, less resilient than even the IPCC has assessed it could have been. That's what we're observing. So the window to 2 degree probability is closing very, very fast. Okay. Just a short update on the global emission sources. On the bottom you see the development of energy-related emissions between 1970 and 2004, and this is fossil fuel CO2 emissions. They are not only the largest growing emission source, they are also absolutely the largest emission source. Whereas the other emission sources on the top, this bluish stuff is N2O from agriculture and other man uses. In the middle, the greenish stuff is methane from agriculture, a little bit of energy, and methane from waste. More or less stable between 1997 and 2004, slight growth rates, but not comparable to CO2 from fossil fuels. The figures, or the columns above the fossil fuels, the orange stuff is the CO2 decay from peat and CO2 from deforestation, which indeed is growing between 1970 and 2004, but again not as strong and not as eminent as fossil fuel use. And that means if we want to address climate change, we need to address fossil fuel use. And as much as I, coming from an organization from WWF which invests lots of money in forest protection, if we want to protect the forests, we need to reduce fossil fuels first. We are not opposed to putting support for forests out there, just the opposite. But there's a tendency in the public and the political debate to make the forest issue a key issue for climate change, unfortunately. That is very narrow-minded. Because climate change, if you don't address fossil fuels first, the simple emissions of fossil fuels will be so strong that even if you protect the forests, the impacts of climate change on forests may be disastrous. That's why you have to do both in addition. So who's responsible for emissions? Annex 1 stands for developed countries, non-Annex 1 for non-developed countries, and international bunkers stands for emissions which have not been allocated to any party, which are mainly aviation and marine shipping emissions. Between 1990 and 2005, for red to yellow, mainly the non-Annex 1, the developing countries have increased their emissions by almost 50%. Nevertheless, the Annex 1, the developed countries, still provide the biggest chunk of emissions. So no excuse for that one. But don't hide behind China, please. Where do the emissions come from? What is the major source of emissions in particular developing countries? This is coming from the review report from British Petroleum, which do usually a quite interesting and quite accurate assessment of fossil fuel resource use. Green is 1997, yellowish is 2007. On the left side is production, on the right side is consumption of coal. On the right side of those graphs, you have Asia Pacific, and you see that between 1997 and 2007, just in 10 years, coal production and consumption in Asia Pacific almost doubled. However, coal consumption in the US, North America, and in Europe more or less remained the same. So, if you put those together, the OECD countries, Europe and North America, you would have similar coal consumption and production as in Asia Pacific. Okay, despite the trends which are escalating, where does the world need to go in order to have a decent chance to stay below 2 degree warming? And what does it mean for the European Union as a proclaimed leader? That's coming from the IPCC report. And don't get hung up on the various colors. Just look at this green curve, this fat green curve at the bottom of that one. That fat green curve crosses the zero line sometime between 2060 and 2080. Goes below zero. And zero of the world CO2 emissions. Starting currently with about 40-50 and going down zero globally. Those are so-called low-carbon scenarios reviewed by the IPCC, which help us to stay around 2 degree global warming. Not necessarily well below, but around 2 degree global warming. But they tell us that the world needs to be zero emission. The world, not just Europe, the world, by about the early part of the second part of the century. And that implies, from equity and fairness reasons, I come back to that one, that Europe and the rich countries have to do more because they have started the mess. They have injected the carbon burden in the atmosphere, and they're responsible for the first signs of climate change we are seeing, whereas developing countries just start to emit, which is no excuse, but just a description of the so-called, if you allow, historic responsibility. So keep in mind, we need to be globally zero emission if we want to have a decent chance to stay below 2 degrees and zero around 2050, 2060 globally. That's a trend. The biggest emissions are coming from the power sector. That's the trend, if nothing happens, coming from the International Energy Agency. Power is not only the biggest CO2 emitter, it is also projected to remain the largest emitter. Depicted in blue here, followed by transport in red, industry in yellow, and the other ones. So keep that in mind. Power is mainly coal, but also natural gas and in some parts of the world oil. The reason why power is so important is because as countries become richer and become more wealthy, they tend to replace normal fuels with electricity. That's the normal trend. Second, we have about 1.4 or 1.6 billion people in the developing countries without access to any electricity, and that's the right to see electricity. So that's the challenge. We need to address the power sector as a key emitter in the future first. Because there's a need for power, and there are emissions in the power sector. That's the reason why the emission trading system is so important, because the key objective of the emission trading system, as I see it, is to control and curtail the emissions of the power sector under the emission trading system. But let's look at emissions. On the left side, we're seeing 2007 annual emissions for the countries, and you see the first time China, that was in the media, overtook USA. Oh, evil China, worse than the US, ooh, and reddish. 20.6% of global emission. US only 90.3%. Europe, 12%. We don't play any role. Do we? Yes, we play a role. If you look into the historic responsibility, of course, which is not a kind of legal, how should I say, a legal provision, and you look into the cumulative emissions since mankind started to burn fossil fuels, since 1751, that's since the data are available, you see that the US, in blue on the right side, is responsible for almost 30% of all emissions, because CO2 stays so long in the atmosphere. The mess we are seeing is caused by the accumulation of CO2 emitted by our ancestors, I'm trying to say. Not that they were guilty, but on the other side, I would say ignorance doesn't prevent from some kind of responsibility. China is only then 8.5%. The rest of Europe is suddenly 18%. The rest of Europe means the rest of the EU, and then you add Germany and the UK with 6.4 and 6% historic emissions, and you see that the European Union suddenly has a higher responsibility than the United States of America. So much for the EU to take the lead. I think they just do what they have to do. Okay, those were just the absolute country emission. Now let's look at another differentiator. Every person has a right to live. Every person has a right for food, for fodder, for shelter, for education. I'm not saying every person has a right to emit, but every person is judged on its share, so to speak, of the global common in the atmosphere. Then you see, if you look into per capita emission, that's an indicator of who is really polluting. And that's independent of the historic stuff. Just where we stand today, on the left side, per capita emissions in the year 2007. Then you see China on the left side, still very much below the US, very much below Russia, Japan, Germany, Canada, and the United Kingdom. India in yellowish is even meaningless, I would say. So where should we focus on to have emission reductions first? From equity and fairness reasons. I'm not saying China and India shouldn't do anything. That's not my point here. But my point is, we want to have a fair, equitable regime. We should address the emission reduction there where they occur first. If we go even more extreme on the right side of this, on the right graph, and we look into cumulative emissions in terms of tons carbon per person. If you add the emissions on average per person, which have lived between 1751 and 2007, I know it's a very academic calculation, but again, it translates the historic responsibility into some kind of equitable measure, then you see that the difference is even still higher than compared per capita emission today. US, Russia, UK, Germany and others outweigh by far the Indians and the Chinas. So much for responsibility. I think we have to keep that in mind if we enter the debate about the energy package. I'll come back to that one. This is coming from the IPCC Climate Needs for 2020. The IPCC came out with a scenario and said, we need in Europe, we need in the developed countries an emission reduction by 2020 of 25 to 40% below 1990, absolute emission reduction. And we need a substantive deviation from the baseline emissions in developing countries in order to comply to some extent with the low carbon scenarios reviewed by the IPCC. And this 25 to 40% is one of the drivers for the EU to have proposed that target at the energy, at the Head of States Council in 2007, Marc talked about, what they said, we're going to do, as a EU, 20% reduction by 2020 based on 1990, even if the world falls apart. We do it anyway. And we will increase the target towards a 30% emission reduction if other countries would take comparable action. Well, that was the detail. What are comparable action? Which countries do you mean? Which parties do you mean on that one? This is subject to debate. But the unilateral action by the EU, as welcome as it is, from our point of view, is at this point in time not sufficient. Because we believe the EU should have gone individually to 30% for a variety of reasons. To give it good news, we see, and this is much triggered by the EU, currently between 1997 and 2007, and also as a result of the Renewable Energy Directive Marc mentioned in Europe, we have seen a fundamental increase, almost 30% per year, of global wind power installed capacity. Most of that one between 1997 and 2006 in the European Union. Spain, Denmark, Germany, increasingly Netherlands, hardly anything in the UK. A very exponential growth and delivering about 1.5% of all electricity of the world already. Quite a good thing. If you look into new installed capacity just in the last year, then the picture changed a little bit. We see that wind power, as one of the most promising technologies in the world for clean technology, is not growing just in Germany and Spain anymore. The blue graphs depict the installation of capacity in 2007, the last year. And you see that US and India and China pick up very strongly with the growth in Europe. That's very good. The growth of wind power in the US in particular is based on a renewable energy portfolio law in Texas, which was legislated by, guess who? Governor Bush in 1998, before he became president of the US. So this law takes back. I probably didn't know what he was doing, but he was doing something good. Honestly, the biggest growth in the US is in Texas, in his own country. Quite interesting. Okay, in that context, we need to look at the package. I'm sorry if I made this long introduction, but it's important to have that kind of thing. What we're having currently is a strong debate between the Parliament and the Council on how the Commission proposals of these legislative pieces are being addressed and are being agreed on. What we're having, I'm giving you basically an update. That looks pretty dull here, but I'll give you an update on what the Parliament has decided last week on the Commission proposal on the various legislative pieces. Either confirm the Commission proposal, sometimes even strengthen it, or sometimes weaken it. Mostly, I must say, as a summary up front, the Parliament, in their limitless wisdom, I must say, it is not cynical, basically strengthened the Commission proposal, which wasn't very likely when we talked with the Parliament in the last months, because they were running around like a little bit like headless chicken, but they got their act together. A big debate. Where's the ring? Probably my wife. A big debate was in the Council, no, a big debate in the Parliament was how does Europe deal with the fact that other countries take up commitments? Because the Commission has proposed we go up to 20% automatically, and if other countries do comparable things, we go to 30%. There was a big debate of the parliament because they woke up and said, well, going to 30%, that invokes some problems with the economy. We can't do that easily. Heads of states haven't thought about, let's ditch that one. What, of course, would be a betrayal of the head of state's council conclusion. So there was a big debate about the so-called trigger. What is a trigger when after Copenhagen, the council would say, we go automatically from 20 to 30. Is the council allowed to do that one? And the parliament finally maintained the trigger and did not call for a co-decision. Did not call for parliament and council and all of them sitting together again and discussing whether the outcome of Copenhagen is good enough, whether they should ratify or not. They maintained the trigger. That was a very fundamental debate. Because within the council, you have now heads of states, and I can name them. It's Poland, it's Italy, it's Slovenia, it's Hungary, I think it's the Czech Republic, the incoming presidents of the EU, who want to get rid of the trigger. Italy even wants to get rid of the 20% minimum. But the parliament maintained the trigger. Second, what the commission has proposed, what makes sense. They have said you go to 20 or whatever, 30%, you just don't start from here, and suddenly you are there. You need to have a linear pathway reduction, which you have to report on, so that you don't come to the idea in the year 2019 and say, sorry guys, we missed the boat, we haven't done anything in the past, now it's too late. So you need to report each year on a linearly declining reduction pathway, where you're standing. And that's been confirmed by the Parliament. The Parliament also limited the amount on clean development mechanism and GI in the effort sharing proposal. The effort sharing proposal contains all those gases, all those policies and measures which are not covered by the emission trading system. The emission trading system covers about 45 to 50% of all gases in the EU which are emitted, and includes all energy-intensive industries, all large polluters, steel, cement, paper, pulp, chemicals, and the power sector, plus aviation. The effort sharing proposal contains all the other sectors: transport, small and medium-sized enterprises, buildings, agriculture, HFCs, etc., etc., etc. That's how the Commission separated them out. There was a quite generous allowance in the effort sharing proposal to buy credits from the clean development mechanism from outside the EU, which the Parliament has now limited. Also, the Parliament has said, whenever you buy quality credits from outside the European Union, carbon credits, they should be gold standard credits. I think it's great, actually. Gold standard is a quality premium carbon standard, which WWF helped develop, which is it's independent now, which do really independently verified, high-quality, good carbon products outside the EU, mainly in developing countries, which are additional, have for sustainable development, and so on and so on. Second, the Parliament also did not allow that there is so-called borrowing. Some countries have said, okay, we agree on the annual linear binding reduction pathways to 2020, but we need some flexibility. We need to borrow from the future. we need to borrow 2 to 3% emissions from the future. So, but once you borrow, I mean, you never give it back in the end. No? So the Parliament reduced this borrowing allowance to 1%. That's okay. And the other thing is what's new, which was not in the Commission proposal. The Parliament injected a strong penalty in the effort sharing proposal. So all the policies which come out of the effort sharing proposal, if you don't meet your targets as a member state, and you have different targets there for each member state, you have to pay back. You have to pay €100 per ton of CO2 for each ton you're missing. Plus, you have to reduce your emissions anyway later on. So you cannot buy your way out. You have to do both. You pay a penalty, and the money goes into a fund for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and reduce deforestation. And you have to also reduce your emissions later on. Yeah? So you penalize, and you have also interest rate on that one. You have not only to reduce, if you miss out by 10 tons, you have to reduce your emissions later on by 13 tons, factor 1.3. It's kind of interest rate. That's a good thing. I don't think it survives with the Council, but the Parliament was pretty brave on that one. The Parliament also included for the first time as a proposal emissions from marine transport. Marine transport is that's where the bunker fuels I mentioned before are one of the big black holes in the overall accounting system, because marine emissions are growing quite drastically, globally, quite fast, and no one has a clue how large those emissions are and who's responsible. So to include them makes really sense. The Parliament also said we shouldn't stop at 2020. Let's go to 2035. Let's have a 50% greenhouse gas reduction target for the EU by 2035 and a 60 to 80% by 2050. We would argue we would have needed 100% by 2050. But again, it's a first step forwards to address issues post 2020 in order to have a long-term view to also give investment security for the industry. Parliament also injected, which we thought was very good, that we should have a binding energy consumption reduction target of 20% by 2020. Again, 2020. As you may remember or not remember, there are a couple of research results out there showing that the European Union can meet many of its energy security targets, reducing dependence from oil import, reducing greenhouse gas emission reduction, creating jobs, saving money, by basically investing a lot in energy efficiency. And the Commission had published 2 years ago a quite interesting energy efficiency action plan and made very sophisticated calculations. And they're showing that if the European Union, as such, would reduce its primary energy consumption by 20% below a reference case by 2020, and this would be implemented through energy-saving measures in transport, in the building sector, God knows where else, would save about up to 150 billion euro per year, simply through reduced fuel bills. Because energy dependence is growing because we're importing more and more oil and gas, because usually the internal resources of oil and gas in the EU are running out, mainly Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK. And we would create up to 1 million new jobs in the EU. That was a good argument. But the Head of States Council in 2007 never made this a legally binding target, although everyone talks about energy efficiency. Those are the low-hanging fruits we should do anyway. To make it legally binding, no one has the guts to do it. So the Parliament put that in. I wonder how this survives or not. Another thing, and now we come to equity thing. The Parliament put in, the European Union should each year support developing countries for adapting to climate change with 5 billion euro per year and going to 10 billion euro per year in 2020. They haven't clarified and where that money A should come from, could come from, and B, who would be the recipient and what would be the conditions. But the principle is in there, and that's a very good thing. So, also they supported the call from many individual parliamentarians that in addition to the support for adaptation, Europe should support developing country decarbonization in the widest sense. That means support for addressing deforestation, support for clean technology, technology transfer, and so on and so on. But they didn't give a number to that one. But they said this is part of our historic responsibility. So that issue which we inserted in the negotiation there, as a historic responsibility, a good Copenhagen deal requires substantive financial transfer, has been embedded there by the Parliament. How much survived? I don't know. Second thing, a European emission trading system. Again, the financial issues. The European emission trading system, according to the Parliament, should use all the auction revenues from the emission permits for climate purposes. Can imagine you would auction the emission permits to all those companies which receive emission permits based on the cap, the emission limit which is given to them. They still have to buy the permits for a variety of reasons. It creates an economic level playing field and also addresses the polluter pays principle. It's quite a lot of money. According to the Commission, was auctioning revenues, was 100% auctioning in the power sector, we could create about 50 billion euro per year, roughly, based on the carbon price of, I think it was 38 euro per ton of CO2. It's quite a lot of money. and they said, the commissioner said, this money should go maximum 20% to climate and other issues. All the other money should go into the treasury. The treasuries, they all want to have the money, the finance ministers. Parliament said, the money should be earmarked. The money should be earmarked for the global need to address decarbonization, to help developing countries to meet their sustainable development goals while decarbonizing their economy. So it should be earmarked. 50% of that one should go to developing countries. Surprised me a lot. I mean, we have worked with Oxfam on that one, particularly on the 50% to developing countries. So I said before that one, I'm happy if you get 20%, because first thing is, earmarking auction revenues is a big fight with the financial ministry, and second, earmarking it outside the European Union is another shit fight. So I was surprised to get this 50% through. I talked to my Oxfam colleagues the other day and said, listen guys, we should have asked for 80%, you know, because the Euro's rich enough. So sometimes Parliament is really, get the act together, get the argument. The power sector has to buy all their emission permits, 100% auctioning. The energy intensive sector needs to go to auctioning for the permits, for the permit permits, to 100% up to 2020, and they start with 15% from 2030 onwards. That is a concession to those guys, because some people think they're exposed to external unfair competition, but eventually they have to go to full auctioning as well. But I think finally it's a good outcome if it remains. The sectors which are exposed to carbon leakage is being defined as you would have a company, let's say in Belgium, someone would impose a tax on you or a kind of burden, or what you think it's a burden. You close down the factory, you go to China or India, preferred example, always China, India, yeah? And then you open another factory there, and you would comply with much less strict standards, you would have the same output of the product, but you would emit much more. That's the theory of carbon leakage. I think it's bollocks if you ask me, but that's a different thing. People believe there is a kind of carbon leakage issue because Europe, per se, is the most efficient economy in the world, blah, 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 which is by the way not true. But that's the issue where industry has inserted this kind of virus in the debate. He said, don't burden us. Don't give us too much auctioning. Don't give us too many caps. You know, we're exposed to competition. Otherwise we close down and go to China. It works, it's stick and carrot. The industry is using that one. And of course, in times of financial crisis and times of unemployment, no one wants to lose 500 jobs in a factory here, in some cases 1,000 jobs in a factory there. That is an economic argument, and the trade unions play a role there as well. The Parliament has confirmed that the CDM, external credits, can meet 40% of the effort in the European emission trading system, which we think is still much too high. But that's the way it is. It wasn't strength. In Newsday, what the Parliament put in, which we think is very, very important, they put in under the CCS directive, the Directive for Carbon Capture and Storage, the CERF directive, an emission performance standard, which is coming from California. We import stuff from the US. I think it's good, from Arnie Schwarzenegger. What the Californians have been doing in the last 2 summers is they have said, we need to do something on coal. We realized if we have a cap and trade system, how long time we have still?
Well, minus 10 minutes.
We have a cap and trade system. What we want is, we want to get at coal. Our cap and trade system in California may not be strong enough to disincentivize new dirty coal. So let's just legislate coal and saying they're not allowed to emit more than a certain amount of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced. For both produced in California and for electricity imported by California from neighboring state. That went through. The emission ceilings was 500 grams per kilowatt hour. Doesn't say too much. We think it's too high. We have been asking for 350, but those guys think what works in California should work here as well. It's fine. At least the seed is in there. The coal industry doesn't like that one, you can imagine, because that would be the end of conventional coal burning, if that would be agreed. Also, it's valid only for new build coal and for large power stations, but it's a start. That is new. The Commission has not proposed that one. The last part is the Renewable Energy Directive. Basically, and Jason Anderson talks about that later, and I'm just keep it short. The Parliament has confirmed that the target should remain 20% renewables, should be part of the energy mix by 2030 of all primary energy. There was not big debate. The changes were in the big debate about biofuels or renewables in the transport sector, which were earmarked to 10%. They must contain now at least 2% second generation biofuels, whatever that one is, and 2% renewable electric transport, electric cars driven by renewable energy, public transport fueled by renewable electricity, which we think is a very good thing, it's a very innovative thing. They also maintain and endorse the preferred grid access in the system. That's a very important thing. You may have a target of 50% renewable in the system. If you have incumbents, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, who run the grids, they don't let you on the grid. It's the same as if, let's say, the car companies would own the highways. As if Mercedes and BMW would own the highways, the car highways, they would decide, when it comes to Honda, no, we don't let them on the highways. It's not our car. Huh? When it comes to Toyota, no, we don't let them on. That's the same thing what we see in the power sector. So the grids are very, very strategically important. So preferred grid access is fundamentally important. You would allow renewables to get into the grid, otherwise you can have any target. Also very important, the Parliament manifested that any renewable target in Europe should not undermine the successful feed-in tariffs in Spain, Germany, France, and somewhere else, which had preferred grid access. And so, by the way, the biggest opponent to preferred grid access are the Polish and the UK. UK is anyway one of the most ambiguous countries I ever came across here. They talk so green and they are so brown on the other side. Really, I mean literally brown. So our question is, and that's the key question, if the Council goes in disclosure with the Parliament, is the EU taking responsibility in general? Are they creating sufficient funding for clean technology in the south in addition to any emission reduction target? Are they helping to be innovative, brokering deals on energy efficiency standards globally, which could be part of the G8+5? Is the EU creating technologies that lead, that create new jobs, that innovate? Does the EU guide development for sound and credible reduced deforestation activities, or do they just rely on the carbon market to solve the mess in Brazil and Indonesia? Is the EU able to address coal as the largest offender to climate change, not just in Europe, but globally? I think those are the biggest questions which I would ask as a citizen, which I would ask as someone who looks beyond the nitty-gritty of this package. If that comes out, is that part of the deal? But they can go to Copenhagen and offer something. I'm not going there and saying, we're doing 20%, we are fine, leave us alone, no, we're doing 20%. That's not a way to get a deal in Copenhagen. Okay, this is the last one. What I think, which is very important, and what people like me and others have to do more, is to look into the economic benefits of a strong EU climate policy. I'll give you a couple of examples. The external costs of coal in the European... It's football tonight, I know. Listen. Not in Spain. Coal's external costs. And then you can go football. This is the last one. I understand this fully. Coal's external costs. External costs identified as costs which are not caused or which are not linked to climate change. External costs such as mining coal, the classical pollutions, water resource management, and so on, health issues of miners, which can be pretty well assessed. Coal's external costs in the EU are estimated to be about 40 to 60 billion euro per year. That is about 0.7% of Europe's GDP. IPCC and the external product by the Commission has assessed that one. That is what you all are paying, or we are paying, somehow, with our taxes, somehow, not directly, not in the energy price, external costs. On top of that one, the EU 15, and I only have the figures for the EU 15 from the European Environment Agencies, EU 15 are paying fossil fuel energy subsidies of about 20 billion euro per year, another 0.2% of our GDP, gross domestic product. You can say that basically for fossil fuel energy, mainly for coal, almost 1% of GDP is going down the drain. We would create a level playing field here. That would be the biggest boost for renewables I could imagine. I can give you the global figure if you wish. The World Bank has assessed, this is no number which comes by triage. The World Bank has assessed that global subsidies for fossil fuels are about $240 to $260 billion per year, globally. If only a small part of that one would go to energy efficiency and renewables, it would be somewhere else. But the incumbents are also benefiting from hidden and open subsidies. Okay. We currently have in the EU mainly EU 15, 150,000 people, mainly EU 15, employed directly, not indirectly, directly employed in renewable energies. We would have a renewable energy target of 20%. We could create up to 900,000 jobs in the EU 27 by 2020 with a 20% target. This is a Commission impact assessment. For comparison, the EU cement sector, and those are the guys who are crying loudest, who say we're going to go bankrupt, emission trading kills us, and drive us out of the country. They currently employ about 60,000, and the steel sector about 300,000 jobs. I'm not saying we should close them down, that's not my point. But I should say the argument and the focus of DEWIC should be on the winners, which are very badly organized, and not always on those which are partly, or could be partly, the losers. I think that's important here to keep in mind. A strengthened building directive, which is currently being reviewed as we speak. Marc mentioned this was agreed in 2002, but comes under the effort sharing directive. If it's done properly, will reduce emissions by 460 megatons CO2. That's about 10% of all CO2 emissions in the EU. May create up to 400,000 jobs in construction and reduce energy bill by approximately 1 billion barrel oil. Altogether, an equivalent to about 1.5% GDP savings. This is just the economic numbers, and this doesn't come from us, it comes from IEEP. IEEP is an association of businesses who work in construction. These are economic figures from business and industry. Another one, keep in mind, Europe imports, we currently import about 4.8 billion barrels of oil per year. We pay, just for this import of the barrel, that's not the price we pay at the pump, because we pay all the tax on top of that one. Just for this import, we pay about $300 billion based on $70 per barrel. It's the current oil price. It's approximately 3% of all GDP. The number comes from British Petroleum, and I don't think they have a reason to like it. If you would add the natural gas imports, and assuming that the oil and gas price link is maintained, what is, because gas is very much linked to the oil price, you just pay for oil and gas imports 6% of the EU GDP. So much for reducing energy, so much for reducing carbon dioxide from ecological reasons. There are so many other reasons. Energy security, saving money, which makes so much economic sense to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. That's a point which should drive the EU towards a 30% target as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephan, for putting the EU in international context. As you can clearly see from setting targets, they can be this. Our target is obviously always to save 20 to 30 minutes at minimum for debate. We have, even with the two presentations, run over time. And I see that several people don't feel the appetite to engage in the discussion right now. I'm willing to take another 10 minutes for questions, or otherwise I'm sure the speakers are available for discussions here in front, whatever you prefer. Any urgent questions immediately?
Ich kann meine Präsentation gerne hier lassen, die kannst du gerne haben danach. Oh, sorry. I just got a German SMS from a friend who asked me whether what football is, so sorry. I said, I can leave my presentation here, there's no copyright on it, you can use them all, and I
can put it up on the web.
Yeah, whatever you want.
So perhaps then it's best for today, and we try, as the EU and many other countries, in meeting their emission targets, we'll try hard next time to improve and get closer to the target of saving 20 to 30 minutes for discussion. That's a firm promise. not legally binding, but I know that that should be part of the deal. So then I would like to thank the speakers once more and perhaps close for today. They will be available, I think, for a little bit discussion if you are interested in Frontier. Thank you very much for coming. Next week we will have in more detail what we touched upon this tonight already a little bit. That's the CO2 emissions from cars, and the current discussions ongoing in that respect with Marc Ferguson of the IEEP and Christian Hay of the German Advisory Council on the Environment. So I hope to see you all back next week or in Frontier for the discussion if you are interested. Thank you very much.